Greetings, BlazeLeeDragon here, and today I have a very special video for you. Today, I'm going to talk about paths, names, titles, and all that kind of stuff, and why I stress in every video not to limit yourself to one path. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a real-life physical demonstration, not of magic, of martial arts, because it's relevant. So let me give you a little example here. Hopefully this can be seen. So in Chinese martial arts, you have a side kick, which is performed like this, right? Your body's pretty much straight forward, the leg comes up, turns over sideways, okay? In Japanese, it comes out to the side and it's straighter, right? In Korea, you chamber your kick and then kick out, okay? Now, on top of that, you have different spots you can hit. You can hit the leg, you can hit the thigh, you can hit the stomach, you can hit the head, you know, so you can hit wherever you want on the body. And depending on where you hit, depends on what it does. You can hit him in the stomach, knock the wind out of him. Hit him in the leg, cripple him, slow him down. You can also have different deliveries to close the distance. You can step behind with your sidekick. You can skip with your sidekick. You can do a jump sidekick. You can do a flying sidekick where you run at him. You can do a back pivot kick, which is essentially a turning sidekick. Now, what's the point of all this in regards to magic? That's the big question. Easy. Every bit of magic out there has got the same basic elements. So you're going to see a lot of the same practices regardless of what you call yourself. So, just like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, you're going to have that same sidekick. And that's just one technique. You're going to see, you're going to see the same thing in magic as far as breathing techniques, focusing drills, types of meditation, breathing, and I said breathing, and different ways of focusing and directing energy. A lot of the same principles are going to be applied to everything. Number one rule of magic: all energy follows thought. Very important. I'll get back into that later. For this first part of the series of magical videos I'm going to do, this one's going to focus on what you call yourself. Now, because there are so many things that I've studied, learned about, talked about, spoken with others, experimented with, etc., I am actually going to read off of a list I created about 10 minutes ago. Now, I created this list just to make sure I didn't forget anything. Now, the only bad thing is if I left something off the list to begin with. So, without further ado, different sorts of magic and titles, etc. And once again, a lot of you seem to think witchcraft, Wicca. That's it. You don't think of anything else. A couple of you will think of psychic skills. So to begin with, on the top of, well, first thing that I wrote down here, Enochian. Ever hear of that phrase? Enochian magic is angel magic. That is when you work with spiritual entities from the celestial plane, interacting with them and having them work with you or asking them to do things for you in a magical sense is Enochian magic. There is an actual angelic script too, by the way. Witchcraft. Practitioners of which are known as witches. Which are known as witches. That's kind of funny. It just kind of flowed kind of nice. So male or female practitioners that practice witchcraft. Witchcraft has a lot to do with the individual empowering themselves by working with the natural forces of nature. You're going to hear that repeated a lot because that's the essence of magic, depending on what region you go to. There are different debates on where witchcraft originated. You usually see it over in Europe. There are those who say it evolved from Druidry, which is also on the list. I'll get to that in a minute. And that the secret practices of just the magical aspect is where witchcraft came from. There's debates. There's always going to be debates. There was a belief that a lot of the witches were actually women because the males pretended they were Christian, and that's why you have a lot of the original Wheel of the Year, right? has been translated over in the Christian and Catholic and stuff holidays is because you had Druidry in this region, and the women weren't respected. You know, there was just men, and they got rid of the goddess, and there was just God. So they actually took out all the female stuff. So the women would go hiding underground. They would dance naked around fire. First of all, fire at night, so that they were away and not exposed to people. The moon being symbol of the goddess. And they would dance around the fire for their rituals and their ceremonies. And then, of course, if they were going to get caught, they would throw water over the fire and throw on their black robes and disappear into the night. Look like they just vanished. So a lot of myths and legends came out of that as well. So that's one theory of where witchcraft came from. Now, Streghera. Streghera is Italian. Never heard of that, have you? Some of you have heard the term strega. Strega is a practitioner of Streghera, although some of them will just say Streghera, and it is, sometimes it's referred to as Italian witchcraft, and the reason they started calling it Italian witchcraft was Raven Grimassi. He wrote a book that was bringing back the old folk magic of Italy. Mainly, Streghera was based off of herbal lore and different ways of working with the natural forces of nature. Once again, you're going to hear that a lot. It's still alive today. A lot of it's very hush-hush. There is a Catholic version, and then, of course, there is the polytheistic original version, too. A lot of the ones that were converted over to Christianity when it was forced on them kept up with a lot of their practices. You know, the wise women and things like that, they would go to Streghera. Wicca. You've heard of Wicca. Now, originally, the Anglo-Saxons had their wise elder people known as, you know, Wicca for men, and Wicca for men and Wicca for women. And that term has been revived by Gerald Gardner, who reintroduced some of these old folk magics that he's been studying and created Wicca. A lot of people have heard of Wicca, and like I said, that's usually the first one they turn to because it's the only one they hear of that they think accepts magic. So, moving on. Druidry. The Druids were the priests, the doctors, the scholars, the magicians of the ancient Celtic societies. Now, they weren't just in the ancient Celtic societies over there in Ireland and Wales and England, and, you know, there's also some in Scandinavia and Iceland and just that whole Norse area. A lot of them had the Druids, and the Druids almost got killed out when the Romans were trying to take over, and they were taking Roman Catholicism and trying to snuff out the polytheistic ways so that they were all united under one church, one religion. Long story there. But basically they snuffed most of it out. A lot of it converted over, or at least gave the appearance of. So a lot of their old sacred sites had stuff built over the top of it. So you'll have a lot of similarities. And then you have some of your original deities, like Brigid, who had just turned into Saint Bridget. Or Cernunnos, who was turned into Saint Cornelius. So you kept a lot of them. Just basically the society wouldn't give them up completely because this was just traditions. So, and of course the seasonal Sabbat's Wheel of the Year was from Druidry. And when they tried to, snuff that out, they wouldn't give up their holidays and celebrations. They'd just put a Christian twist onto them. That's where you get, Christmas from Yule, and Halloween and Samhain, and Easter and Ostra, or Ostara, if you'll call it that. And that's basically what Druidry. Druidry had magic. It was one of the things that they did. They were, they did magic. They worked with the elements. They became one with the land, and they found their place in it. They were very theological. They had a lot of theories. They opened their mind. It was all oral, given from master to student by word of mouth. There was men and women that were trained differently, Anglesey and Avalon, and depending on where you were trained, depending on what your sex was, they believed that the biology of the person, they would learn differently, even if they would work together sometimes. There was bards, there was ovates, there was druids, all of this over in that region, and they did priestly duties, and they worked with, like I said, the elements and the earth around them to bring about healing and prosperity and protection. They would, end wars sometimes, or they would negotiate with the wars. They would give advice and wisdom. A lot of lore out there on the Druids. They were almost completely snuffed out. There are some groups such as the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids in England, which is doing a Druid revival and bringing back the Druid teachings and piecing together back some of their lore. They had the Ogham, scripts. They, worked with animals. They did divination through animals. There's, different cards, and the Nordic runes were also used. They had a very similar to the way the Ogham was used, because your Ogham could be used as sigils on staves or wands or writing lessons. Each of the trees, you cast a branch based on each tree, and each of those would represent one of the Ogham runes for divination purposes, similar to the Norse Futhark runes, which I'll get into those in a minute too. So, I don't want to spend too much time on Druidry. Going on to Magery. Now, Magery has to be mentioned hand in hand with Magus, Magi, and Zoroaster. Zoroaster was an Iraqian prophet who is credited for the creation of magic. Now, the reason I say creation of magic is he was the first known magical practitioner, and the term magic and magi come off of his disciples. He wrote a few texts. His was basically monotheistic, believing in one all-powerful supreme being that was kind of universal. So I guess it depends on how you look at it. Maybe very, very Eastern philosophy kind of a deal. Not necessarily monotheistic as the way a Catholic would think of one God. And Zoroaster had different techniques and skills and talents as far as, divination and alchemy and looking into the stars and changing their fate. Things like that, which is magic. And one of the tribes over there in Iran was known as the Magi. And the Magi are still there. They even make references to the 3 wise men that visited Jesus were Magi. And basically Magi meant wise one. I'm sure you've heard that term before. It's also associated with, like I said, Anglo-Saxons with the Wicca. The wise ones of their village, the elders. And mage, magus, and there was a couple other root words of magus, what I believe was Greek. And there was different words that were associated with it, but it was all around that region, all referring to the Zoroastrians. Can't pronounce the name appropriately. Look it up. It's actually a very interesting read. There is still some material left on that. And that's where you get the term mage and magery. And of course, magery is this craft of working with the fates and the stars and to help alter them through the use of your will, magic. And that's where the root word magic comes from. Of course, I mentioned Zoroaster. Sorcery, sorcerer, sorceress. Sorcery, basically the practitioners of which are known as sorcerers or sorceress. The main difference, you see this in a lot of places. It comes off of a root word, root word, which means source or sorcerer. I can't pronounce it properly, but it means to cast your fate. So a sorcerer controlled the casting of the fates. So basically, sorcery was the manipulation, basically, of the future, in a sense, magic. It was sometimes used interchangeably with witchcraft or witch. Sometimes the witches were considered those who did not use tools, and the sorcerer would use tools, such as wands or staves, things like that. It's debatable, depending on who you talk to and where you look at it. I actually want to add this down here at the bottom before I forget. Oh, I knew I'd forget stuff. So, next on my list, wizardry. A wizard's a practitioner of wizardry, also a wise person, an intelligent one, a crafty person, someone who's a whiz at something, very good at something. They have a lot of programs today called wizards, and it's used in fantasy and fiction a lot as well, but wizard was sometimes interchangeably with magic user, with witch, magician. It was like a high-ranking magician. It was someone who was, high up there in magical practice. Wizardry itself usually was associated with different forms of high magic, which we'll get into that later in a minute too. How am I doing on time? Do I still have time? I do, yay! Okay, sorry, had to check. This is going to be a long video. So, there you get the term wizard. It was used over there in England. Some people debated whether or not it was used back then at all, or if it was just something for fantasy, modern times. So there is that argument as well, but usually wizard and mage were kind of fell hand in hand with magician, which we'll get into magician too in a minute. Warlock. Warlock is, depending on where you go, some the Scottish practices of witchcraft considered warlock to be the male equivalent of a witch. Mostly in Europe, there is a word which is related to warlock. I don't have it written down, but basically it meant oathbreaker. And I myself consider that as well. When I hear warlock, I think oathbreaker. That is insulting. With witchcraft, you would actually swear oaths into your coven. A coven is a group of magical practitioners. Sometimes you can have a coven of vampires, a coven of witches, a coven of Wiccans. Coven's a gathering of individuals with a similar belief. So with that, a warlock would be someone who broke those oaths of secrecy or not betraying their coven, etc. So a warlock is considered a very bad thing. It's considered an insult by most. Like I said, sometimes it is referred to a male magical practitioner. Wu. In China, you had what's called a Wu, W-U. A Wu was basically their wise people, their shaman, wizard, magician kind of people. And they would use different sorts of magic and mysticism. See, I forgot mystic too. See, I keep remembering things at the last second. Anyway, so they would use different types of Eastern internal energies to direct and work with the spirit world to protect against it or to help guide it or to learn from it. They were very big on their ancestors, things like that. So you have your Wu, which is the Chinese equivalent to a magician or a sorcerer. Magician. A magician comes off the root word mage and magi, as I was mentioning with the Zoroasters. A Zoroaster was a person. And magician sometimes is used today to refer to stage magic. I refer to those as illusionists. So when I do my performances, because I do illusions as well, I consider myself an illusionist. If I'm referring to my magical practices, then it would be okay to refer to me potentially, I guess, as a magician. It's a very universal term. A magician is a practitioner of magic. So if you're wondering what to call yourself, magician you can't go wrong with. Just to let you know. So magician, very simple. Practitioner of magic. Clever one. Wise person. Shaman. Now, a lot of people think that shaman is related to the Native American tribes. It is not. Shaman actually comes over from Siberia, and it's Saman, I believe, was the original word that it was based off of. But they're priests over there. The shaman would actually do state of mind, altering things, sometimes hallucinogens, starvation, not necessarily starvation, but fasting. Sometimes they would do ritual mutilation to themselves to obtain wisdom of the higher self. So a lot of people will refer to shamanism and shaman as a very generic term for all of the tribal old religions, the old ways. So shaman is very, like I said, it comes over there from Siberia, and I believe, I might have wrote this down, Turok word, which, like I said, was the Saman one. And the shamans basically would get in tune with the spirit world. Healing was a very big thing for the shamans. They either saw you were missing something or that you needed something, and they would help balance that out. They would speak to the spirits, they would speak to the ancestors, they'd speak to the gods. If there was a spiritual issue, you would go to the shaman. Next on the list, medicine man. Very generic term that the English used for the Native American shamans. Actually, something interesting, the Native American traditions, no matter which one you go to, Cherokee, Sioux, Blackfoot, there's so many tribes that they didn't have names. Now today they do, because the Westerners, the Americans, expect there to be names. You have to refer to someone. Back then they lived in these tribal societies. You just knew that person was, did hunting. You knew this person did spiritual work, priest-like work. That's just what they did. I actually know this one individual who is, can't remember where the tribe he's from. I apologize to him. But he's actually, his title is pipe maker. And he's basically what us English-speaking Americans would consider a shaman of that tribe. But like I said, they didn't really have names or titles, they just were. That's actually kind of cool. The Native American traditions are very, very, very spiritual. They're very one with earth and the nature, and honoring and respecting what they receive from the earth and giving back to the earth. Their spirituality is part of everyday life. There's not necessarily specific people. There are those who excelled at it, like I said, which were these shaman, medicine man kind of people. And they would be responsible for, healing and guiding during ceremonies and things like that. But even each of the warriors were very spiritual and in touch with the earth. So it's a very neat tradition to research itself. Just pick a tribe and Native American traditions are good, if you can find someone who's willing to teach and still knows something of it. The next on my list is psychic. Psychic is often overlooked. Psychic abilities, basically they're abilities of the mind. They are a form of magic, but it is science's way of trying to take metaphysics, which is the study of the supernatural world, the other worlds, and trying to turn it into scientific skills. Psychokinesis, pyrokinesis, telekinesis, psychometry, things like that. Astral projection. These are all psychic skills. There's tons of them. I actually got a really nice book, Develop Your Psychic Skills, but I'll bring that out later in a different book review video. Still doing good on time, I hope. Yay, still got time. Okay. So, next on the list, this is a long list. Psionics, very powerful psychics. Vampire. Vampire, there are 3 different types. There's the sanguinarian, which I might be pronouncing wrong, which are the ones that physically need human blood to be healthy and survive. There are the psi, who are psychic vampires, which is a learned skill. And then there are the blood fetish people who sometimes there's a form of cannibalism to take the person into you and drink their blood to obtain power. Then, of course, there are those that just like the idea of it. So there's the cultural ones as well. But those are the basic 3 ones. The ones that need it physically, the ones that don't need it physically but like it, and then the ones that do it psychically. There are some who consider themselves hybrids who do both. The sanguinarian are actually said to be stronger, faster, live longer, not get as sick as easily. And there's huge resources on vampirism. Usually, like I said, it's the middle one if you're choosing to get into that. That's a path as well that practices different types of magic and has its own religion and philosophy depending on what type of vampirism you get into. The next one is Psi, I mentioned that. Norse magic, Sigils. Yes, Sigils. Yeah, Sigils. Very hard to pronounce. It's Icelandic, so it's the way that it's pronounced. You have to have this roll, and I'm not doing the tongue roll right, but it's Sigils. It's S-E-I-D is the English way of spelling it, but basically they were the magical practitioners of the Norse people, of the Vikings. And the Norse people had their spiritual people that, had the Futhark runes. You've heard of Futhark runes. They're not witches' runes. They're Nordic runes. They came from the god Odin, who was both a powerful warrior and a wizard or a scyther. And they have this spirituality which is very rooted in the land that they live in. They had different ways of braiding their hair, and they would braid the spells into the hair to protect their warriors. Magic was very much part of the life. They were very respectful of the other worlds, and they, I guess, kind of very superstitious people. They knew that there was repercussions spiritually for a lot of things that they decided to do or not do. Egyptian magic, Hika, H-E-K-A, might be mispronouncing it again. The Egyptians, magic was part of their everyday life. The spiritual world was side by side. Everyone was spiritual. They didn't have specific, necessarily, people that stood out, such as shaman-like people. They just all were. Everyone had their, rituals and things that they did in their home. The Hinduism. Hinduism is considered one of the oldest spiritualities, and they have, magic. They have their puja. They have, which is an altar, it's type of ceremony. I don't know a lot about it. I am starting to learn a little bit about it. Very beautiful religion. Everything, like I said, is sacred. It's very similar, like I was mentioning with the Norse magic and the Egyptian magic. It's part of everyday life, and it's a big cultural thing too. For a lot of people in India. Hinduism is a very, very neat spirituality. It has multiple gods and goddesses, which they consider to all be connected as one, and each individual guru, which is their spiritual leader, depending on which guru you spoke with, will tell you different things based upon their interpretation on it. It's really neat. Like I said, it goes back maybe about 4,000 or 5,000 years. The language has stayed the same, so it stayed the same name. It's kind of neat. Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is actually derived from Hinduism. Siddhartha Gautama was the original Buddha. Buddha is an enlightened one, an awakened one. And there has been many Buddha. The original, like I said, was Siddhartha. Siddhartha was an Indian prince, and he developed Buddhism. And there's Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and Shen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism was brought over to Japan. Tibetan Buddhism, of course, was to Tibet. And Shen, C-H-E-N, Shen Buddhism was brought to China. It was brought to China by another Buddha in 500 CE, or Common Era, and his name was Talmo, T-A-M-O, also known as Bodhidharma. Talmo brought it to the Shaolin monks, and of course they incorporated it with their teachings, which is the next part that I was going to mention. Some of the Chinese folk magic. I mean, we mentioned Wu, but there is Taoism, Taoists, Shen Buddhists. Then you also have the Shaolin, which I'll get into in a minute as well. The different types of other philosophies, they also had Confucianism. Lao Tzu is the one who introduced Taoism, and it brought both a moral as well as a spiritual way of interacting with the world around them. I'm sure you've heard of Feng Shui, Yin-Yang, the two opposing forces that are both equal and opposite and part of each other. Very big lesson that I could go into, but I won't go into too deeply just because of time constraints. But the Taoists, believed in this state of Pu, which is this naturalness. It's like I explained in some of my other videos, it's kind of like an uncut piece of wood just lying there. It is just being. This is achieved through Wei Wu Wei, or action without action. This is basically, this goes right into Shaolin. Okay, the Shaolin were these monks that practiced martial arts to realize their physical existence in this world, is also to strengthen themselves from the inside out or the outside in. Either way, they would have these practices and they would develop themselves. The Taoism and Confucianism and Shen Buddhism were all mixed together to create what the Shaolin were. And in general, folk magic in China and a lot of these different paths, Eastern philosophy and mysticism, as it was called, was about truly developing yourself and seeing your place in the world and becoming one with it. Very similar to the way the Druids were. It was just, like I said, this was the Eastern philosophy of it. So they would develop themselves and open themselves up. There are magical practices that they would do that had to do with the chi, or the vital life forces within inside of you, and moving them with breath and motions of the body. They did have different rituals and ceremonies as well. Now, that's, like I said, I'll get into a little bit of that later, because I do mention some of the actual forms that they did that were magic related as well. But they do have Taoist mysticism and magic. So next one is alchemy. You might be familiar with that. It's working with alchemical stuff. One of the main purposes behind it was to try to turn lead into gold, try to create gold. But alchemy was changing the different elements. Black magic. Now, that's one a lot of people don't mention or talk about, because it is stated that there's not black magic or white magic, it just is. It's based upon, what's in your heart. You'll hear that a lot. It's very popular. It became very popular, say, after the movie Practical Magic, and I believe The Craft might have had something in it. I can't remember. They were older movies, but regardless, this was mentioned. A lot of people liked it and started repeating it. It was talked about and mentioned before that, which is where the movie was influenced to say it. But my point is, black magic is something that people talk about and mention, and they consider it to be of the negative variety. But there's the argument, what's considered negative. So that's just I don't like to use the term. I just thought I would mention it because it is talked about. You will hear black magic and white magic. It's people's attempt to say, well, black is negative and harmful, and white is helpful and protective. Anything that you do has the potential to be harmful or protective. If you are removing illness, technically that's black magic, even though you're healing the person. If you are putting a protection spell because you don't think that person should be with a particular individual, let's say it's a family member, they're getting beaten, so you cast a protection spell to banish that other person, it's considered white magic even though you're getting rid of them. So I mean, it just depends on your viewpoints. I try to ignore that. Chaos magic. Chaos magic is a very, very unusual tradition of magic that is based upon throwing out a great deal of high vibrational energy to allow changes to just happen. It's almost directionless, and it works off the chaos theory. Put enough effort onto something and pressure until it breaks where it's going to break, so to speak. Dragon magic works directly with the spiritual and astral entities known as dragons. Fairy magic like dragon magic, but works with fairies. These are two of the more popular. There are other versions of creatures of the spiritual realm that you can work with, but these are the two more popular ones. They have their own script, they have their own prayers and spells and chants that are usually used with them, and there are certain ways of interacting appropriately with these otherworldly beings. Then there is Hermetic mages, who are part of the Order of the Golden Dawn. They're very ceremonial, ritual, very elemental related. You have Hoodoo and Voodoo, which is folk magic, which is native to Africa. The Hoodoo and Voodoo was very big on working with the world and the vibrations of it and altering and shifting these. You've heard of stuff like the voodoo doll. These are just physical representations that would help them to direct energy for focusing purposes. There is a lot to it. I don't know a very great deal about it, so I'll just mention it in passing. There is prana, which is one of the forms of Chinese as well as Indian magic, which is closely related to yoga and some of the internal breathing stuff. Prana is one of the high vibrational energies that you can use in magic or mysticism in the East. Kabbalah, or Quabala, depending on how you want to pronounce it, was considered Jewish mysticism. And, wait a minute, Jewish, yeah. Hebrew mysticism, maybe sometimes what I heard it called, Jewish mysticism. Works based upon principles on the tree of life, the Sephiroth, or the fruit of the tree of life. I never gotten too much into the Quabala, but it is a magical path which has spirituality related with it. There is Shinto. Shinto is actually, before I get into that, there's two above that. Santeria, or Santeria, which is a type of religious magical practice that works with the saints, where you're calling upon the saints for help. If I'm incorrect on that, I've researched that in passing. I've not looked at it in many years. I don't know very much about it. There's Satanism. There are various forms of Satanism, some including magic, some not. You have Anton LaVey's version of Satanism, you have those who are rebelling against the church, you have those who worship Satan as a deity, and then you have those who will not think Satan as a deity, but embrace Satan as a concept and base their life upon living it to the fullest. There is no heaven or hell. There is no afterlife. Enjoy life. Get everything you can out of it, regardless of who it harms. One of the principles associated with that form of Satanism. Shinto. Shinto is a Japanese religion, very big folk magic over there, and it is based upon working with what's known as kame. Kame are spirits of the world around you. There's kame in the woods, in the trees, in the leaves, in the water, in the air, and Shinto, they'll have Shinto shrines and houses to appease the kame of that area, because you want to work naturally with the spirits of nature. You don't want to offend them or harm them or force yourself upon them. Well, looks like my computer might have turned off. And it did. I turned my computer off. Apparently I kicked the cord and knocked it out of the wall. Nice. So I tried to rebuild my list the best I could from what was left. Hopefully I'm not leaving anything out. So from where I was leaving off on Shinto and Shinto shrines inside of homes where the kame will live. And like I said, it's one way of interacting with them. And you know, there's ways to befriend the kame. There's also kisai, which is basically like their wise ones in Japan, and then there's Amiodo, which is like a sorcerer, so they have those as well. Then of course you have mysticism, which is a very, very, very generic term for mystic powers. Now when I say mysticism is a very broad and generic term, kind of like magician. When you're thinking of mystic powers versus magic powers, it's just, I guess, kind of an East versus West type of a deal. When you think of mystic powers having to do with the spirit world and interacting in between it. Then you have your Mancers. You have very different forms of Mancers. Probably the most popular are Geomancers and Necromancers. Basically, anything with Mancer or Mancy at the end basically has to do with divination. So your Necromancers would do divinations with the dead. So whether that be reading the entrails of an animal, or summoning a departed person or an entity from the netherworld to learn secrets. Then, of course, there is also the geomancer, who actually I always thought dealt with earth. There are stones, but it's very mathematical, the way that works. And the other thing I wanted to say about the necromancers, there's a lot that are talked about the necromancers, and a lot of people think it means summoning the dead. They do summon the dead to learn secrets. There is different type of, as an example, there's the Necronomicon, and there is the belief that there was an original one written on like lamb skin. Some people said it was human skin, it was probably lamb skin, and it had to do with the gates between the worlds. So the necromancers of the Necronomicon weren't really called necromancers. They had a different name, and they would protect the world between, but they could also walk between the worlds or have creatures come over from the other realms. Those are the main paths and spiritualities and, ways of doing magic that I could think of off the top of my head that I've researched or studied or had books on or talked to people about. And like I said, I really hope I didn't lose anything when I kicked my darn cord out of the wall. Briefly glancing over my books, I don't see anything that pops out to me that I missed. I do want to start talking about some of the different forms of magic. And I'm remembering some that I didn't re-add to my list. Okay, so adding on to my list, there are other titles that I just briefly want to pass over. I've mentioned a lot of titles based upon tradition, and I didn't mention all the ones in the world. There are way more than this, and this video has already gone on probably for close to an hour now. And that's why I wanted to do this. A lot of people are not aware of a lot of these traditions, practices, paths, or even anything about them. So there's healer, guide, mediator, medium, diviner, oracle, seer, soothsayer, wiseman, elder, and witch doctor, as some of the titles just threw at you. Now, as far as types of magic, this is just a couple. You have variations. Like the very beginning of this video, me showing the sidekick and different ways of applying it and applications. A lot of these will have very similar things, but these are some of the techniques and stuff. So let's start with high magic. You'll hear the term high magic. High magic is basically when you do a spell with a lot to it. You have your basic interaction magic, sensing and feeling, projecting, things like that are done right there on the spot. Then you have your magic that takes a couple days to stew and brew. Usually these are associated with spells. So when you do high magic, it's doing it for a higher purpose. So let's say you're doing a, I'm just repositioning myself. Let's say you're doing a love spell. The way that a lot of people will talk about love spells is you are doing it to make yourself be more noticeable, making yourself more appealing. You're not, that person's going to fall in love with me. That's not how magic works, and if you try to do that, you're fighting against their will, which you'll probably lose on, and it's not very healthy for you to let that energy come out of you, nor is it nice to try to do that to someone else. That's still considered high magic when you're doing just the general pulling in of love, or prosperity, or health. Those are things that are usually associated with high magic. Ceremonial magic. Ceremonial magic is when you're doing any form of ceremony, whether that's a hand fasting, which is a type of wedding ceremony, or last rites type of a deal, initiations. It's for a ceremonial purpose, but it still has magic involved with it. Then you have ritual magic. Ritual magic is usually something that is done celebratory. So where ceremonial magic is like a ceremony, ritual magic has to do with appeasing a particular spirit, entity, guide, god, goddess, holiday, something along those lines. You have familiars. You might be familiar with those. Those are animal companions, sometimes physical, sometimes not. There are ways of working with familiars. Warding. Warding is a term. Basically, it's a type of protection. There are many different ways to do warding spells. You have enchanting and loading. They're pretty much the same thing. It depends on how you want to do it. It's about putting your energy into an object, item. Talisman holds energy for you to use. An amulet holds energy to be protective, so it works on its own. talisman you draw on like a battery. You can load these objects or enchant these objects. There is invoking and evoking. The difference being, when you invoke, you're inviting something inside of you. So if you're letting something else speak through you, you're invoking it. Evoking is to have it in front of you. So think of E, exit, in, inside. Okay? So there's evoking and invoking. There's summoning. Pretty self-explanatory. There is herbalism and working with herbs. Basically, each one of the herbs, our medicines are based off of them. They all have different properties. They can help with different ailments or enhancing things. Working with spells. Runes. You have your Futhark runes, you've got your Ogham runes, you have many different types of runes and different types of scripts that you can use. There is spellcraft. Spellcraft is the ability to write spells, craft your own spells. And I'm telling you right now, no matter how many spell books you get, the best is to write your own and learn how they're done. Get a tutor for something like that. I might give you at least basics in one of these videos coming up. Then there is, I was talking about different practices for the Shaolin that were magic and spiritual. Tai Chi, Qi Gong, Xingyi, even with some of the internal stuff like, Pakwa and things like that. Meditation, Ten Shen Qi breathing. There's different types of breath control that they did where they controlled the internal Qi and moved it through their body to make themselves healthier, heal faster, resistant to damage, things like that. A lot of that works on internal focus. And that's where a lot of the mysticism was as far as the Shaolin were concerned. The Eastern mystics had all sorts of different stuff they did. Some of it included incense and things like that. Reiki, very popular Japanese healing method. Traditionally, you get attuned within Reiki. There are symbols that they use to enhance powers as a type of healing. Then, of course, there is the prana healing is, of course, the Chinese version of Reiki, basically. Then there is etheric touch, which is a type of healing. This is where you're touching with intent. You're focusing on a particular ailment, and when you physically make contact to make a headache go away, something like that, that's etheric touch. It's very similar to laying on of hands. Laying on of hands sometimes can work with any form of spirituality, sometimes with outside assistance. Christians have been known to do this. Preachers and healers have been known to touch people. Which those are other titles that I forgot to mention, once again. Priest and reverend and, titles like that as well. Then there is quantum and vibrational healing, which has to do with the fact that we are all vibrating creatures and helping to balance out those energies. Different types of colors, sounds, and tones can be used during that. There's chakra balancing. You have these energy centers throughout your body, and each one of these energy centers has a different amount of energy in them. They spin, they pull in energy, let energy go out, and there's 7 main ones. There's more than that, but there's like 7 main ones that line up throughout your body, and if these are blocked or hindered, you can have ill effects from it and get sick. So that's a type of healing as well. You have sigils that you can make. Sigils are basically taking runes and kind of writing a spell with it and drawing multiple ones together to bring about a spell. You have elemental magic, working with the elements. You can burn your herbs to use the element of fire. You can put them in water to use the element of water. You can bury them in the earth for earth, cast them to the wind for wind. There's different ways of combining the elements in with your spells. Then there's shape-shifting. Shape-shifting is more of an astrological body thing. You don't physically become different, or at least not in the forms of shape-shifting I know and have studied. It has to do with taking on the qualities or traits of an animal or acting out that animal to enhance the abilities that animal has. Smelling of a wolf, or hearing or sight of like an eagle or a hawk, things like that. So that's some of the basics. That's just kind of a brief overview of all these different paths, all these different techniques, all these different methods. Many of them use stuff like circles. Witches are big on casting circles. Wiccans are big on casting circles. A lot of people are big on casting circles. Circles are not a circle, it's actually a sphere, above and below, protecting all things. For those of you interested, if you hear Widdershins, Widdershins is counterclockwise. There is lunar phases of the moon that you can work with to enhance stuff. If the moon is waning, it is becoming less full. If it's wax, battery can die, I can run out of memory, I will finish this video. So, if it's waning, the moon is becoming less full. If it is waxing, it is becoming more full. Depending on lunar cycles, some people cast by the lunar cycles. Some people use ritual tools, wands, staffs, robes, talismans, amulets, rings, crystals, stones, candles, herbs. They'll do different types of offerings. Offerings is, like giving herbs or crafting something and then destroying it to send it into the other world. It has to, it's sending it on. So, my entire point of this long video, which is going to be the first of a series of basic introduction to magic, since a lot of people want that, is there's so much out there. Why limit yourself? In the olden days, when you lived in a tribe, you lived in a village, that was it. You became that practitioner for that region. There wasn't other options. You couldn't really travel without completely moving. Travel's not like it was today. There's no such thing as the internet, books, library. Well, there's books and libraries, but usually it had to do with your language of your tribe and your area. So there was a lot of limited resources. You don't have that today. There's no reason to limit yourself. I mean, this is just off the top of my head. I'm sure there's tons of stuff I'm forgetting. I've got a fairly extensive library. I've had tons of conversations. Some things I only know the basics of. I mean, I could learn, you could learn, everyone could learn for the rest of their life and still not know everything. There's so much out there, and I didn't even name everything. There is folk magic in every region and nationality and nation in the entire world. Look at your roots. Research where you came from. Maybe you have something in your ancestry. Touch back and touch with it, So, this is video 1, long video 1. That is just, like I said, basically introducing some of the names, titles, and paths that are out there. So, be that seeker. Keep looking. And eventually you'll find what you're looking for. So, life is a journey, my friend. Walk it. Blessings. BlazeLeeDragon out and to bed at long last.